All right. Hello and welcome to episode 68 of Not Reserving Judgment, a podcast about the latest intrigues, triumphs, and outrages in Canadian constitutional law. I'm Josh Dehaas, counsel with the Canadian Constitution Foundation.
I'm Joanna Baron, Executive Director of the CCF.
And I'm Christine Van Geyn, the CCF's Litigation Director.
In today's episode, I'll tell you why I think a Conservative member's child safety bill is nearly as bad as the Online Harms Act.
And I'll explain why the Government of Canada is shutting down TikTok offices in this country.
And we'll share our bad legal takes of the week, where we take a lighthearted look at some legal opinions that didn't quite land. But first, I'm going to tell you about an Ontario City Councillor who's in trouble, in part because she tweeted some emojis. Yes, really. So the text was fine, but the emojis were apparently part of a pattern of troubling behavior that must be punished by docking her pay. So I know I sound obsessed with this issue of the free speech implications of the municipal codes of conduct, but I really do think we need to talk about them again because they continue to limit the speech of democratically elected representatives, and there's a disturbing new proposal in Ontario to give these integrity commissioners even more teeth. So this latest example feels like one of the craziest I've ever seen. So Susan Stevenson is a councillor in London, Ontario, who leans to the right and is very concerned about homeless encampments in her ward, which has apparently made her a target of her fellow councillors and city staff who have more politically correct views on the issue. And the result, as far as I can tell, has been at least 3 investigations over her speech, all of which, just seem to be like regular political speech. And Stevenson was investigated first for an ex-post that she made in July 2023, where she linked to an article by CNN commentator Michael Smerconish, who argued that homeless people who decline drug counseling or mental health services or jobs, if able-bodied, should be arrested, which is a pretty mainstream view. So she shared this Smerconish article with the words, London could be first, and a little smiling emoji with 3 hearts that suggests she loves this idea. And this led to complaints that she supports arbitrary arrest of homeless people. And so these outside lawyers funded by taxpayers called the Integrity Commissioner were paid to investigate. So yes, precious tax dollars were spent because a councillor shared a CNN article with a comment and an emoji. So anyway, Stevenson was cleared of that, but only because the lawyers decided that the emoji could not be interpreted as advocating solely for an enforcement approach or for arbitrary arrest of the homeless, which leads me to wonder, what if she had used her position as an elected official to advocate solely for an enforcement approach? Shouldn't she be allowed to do that? In any event, she was warned by this unelected integrity commissioner that it is unnecessary and unhelpful to instigate strong reactions through unnecessarily provocative social media posts, which is a pretty blatant limit on her freedom of expression because being provocative is core to the effectiveness of this expression. Okay, so she was given some training on social media and told not to do it again. Then there's the second investigation. So here she was actually punished, and what she did was a little bit more controversial. So the second investigation was about a photo that she posted of apparently homeless individuals with the words, "Let's address the problem: the needles, the feces, the garbage, the encampments, the open drug use, the erratic and violent behavior, the crime, the vandalism, and the lack of safety." And this led to a flurry of complaints that she was stigmatizing the homeless. And the Integrity Commissioner investigated this tweet and found that it was insensitive and provocative and an invasion of personal privacy because there were people in the photo. And the Integrity Commissioner was forced to accept that this wasn't bullying or harassment, but they did find Stevenson had violated the Code of Conduct provision against, quote, treating members of the public appropriately. So what counts as appropriate? Apparently, whatever the unelected Integrity Commissioner thinks is appropriate, which I take issue with because I think that should be up to the elected councillor to decide. You know, she thinks that encampments are a real issue and she wants to be provocative about it, and I think that's her prerogative. But anyway, under the Municipal Act in Ontario, which is about to get even more harsh, there are currently only 2 sanctions available. One is a reprimand, and the other is removing up to 90 days pay. And so for this tweet with the photo about drugs encampments, crime, and vandalism, the Integrity Commissioner just recommended a reprimand. Fine, but then we get to the third taxpayer-funded investigation into her tweets. And once again, this one is all about the emojis. So back in April, Councillor Stevenson quoted the words of the Deputy City Manager on X, who had told Council that the encampment strategy is, quote, a long-term vision for our community on how we address encampments. They're here to stay. They're the fabric of every municipality now. And what is our strategy to support them and address them? And Stevenson tweeted this out, putting the words long-term and support them in all caps, along with emojis described as the pleading face, the weary face, and the flushed face emoji. So this prompted some very grammatically incorrect email from the Deputy City Manager, who was very angry about this and called it inappropriate, because again, that's what the code says. You can't do things that are not appropriate. And she didn't take down the tweet. Instead, she said, well, I just quoted your words back to you. You expressed a political viewpoint that the encampments are here to stay and that they need to be supported. And so there was a formal complaint. And the Integrity Commissioner sided with the City Manager, saying that these emojis unfairly implied that the views advanced were the staff members' own, rather than reflecting the widely acknowledged prevailing view across the province, that encampments are here to stay and, I guess, need to be supported. So the Commissioner found that this was public criticism, to which I say, like, why can't councillors criticize city staff? I mean, they are paid by us to do jobs for us. But anyway, this report goes on to also say that there's a clear pattern of harassment, including this emoji tweet. The evidence for this is that Stevenson takes the opportunity, even where the issue only relates tangentially to homelessness or shelters, to ask questions in a manner which allows her to repeat her concerns about encampment issues. And according to the Commissioner, although her words and tone may be moderated and sound respectful, the constant revisiting of the issue amounts to her harping on something that has already been well canvassed. And they say she's made thinly veiled expressions of distrust toward administrative staff, and this pattern of conduct and her post identifying the staff member are inappropriate and constitute harassment. Okay, so I watched some of these videos, this supposed harping, and the first video, she's literally being extremely polite, and she just says things like, you know, she wants to know how many homeless encampments do we have? Is it going up? Is it going down? To which the city manager immediately starts yelling at her and saying she takes great offense to these questions. But apparently it's Councillor Stevenson that's doing the harassment here. So I watched another, I'm like, I got to see this pattern of harassment. And she's just asking perfectly reasonable questions in a polite tone. And yeah, maybe it's annoying that she keeps bringing up encampments, but that's a political issue she clearly cares about. So long story short, they don't like what she has to say and she's annoying them. So apparently that's harassment, and she's now been recommended that she lose 30 days of pay. And if you're wondering how much that is, I looked it up. London pays its city councillors the same amount as the median full-time employment income in London, which is interesting. That's $65,137. So Stevenson will be out more than $5,000 if the city accepts this recommendation. So anyway, believe it or not, the Ford government has just brought forward a new bill that would allow councillors to go even further in punishing each other for their political speech. And the bill is not nearly as bad as it could be. It doesn't allow, for example, the Integrity Commissioner themselves to remove councillors for breaches of codes of conduct, which is what a lot of activists had been pushing for. But it does allow for a provincial Integrity Commissioner to investigate and recommend removal where a councillor has been engaged in a contravention that is of a serious nature and that has resulted in harm to, quote, health, safety, or the well-being of any person. And if they make this recommendation, then it'll go back to council, and council, if they decide unanimously that they want this other councillor gone, they can remove them from council. And In some ways, it's a pretty high bar because you do need that unanimity. But I also think based on how often single counselors who have divergent views get targeted by these investigations, that we will see a lot of, counselors saying that they should remove one of their members because they don't like their political views. So I'm not really in favor of this at all. Joanna, what do you think? What do you think about this proposal from the Ford government? Does it go too far in your view?
I mean, I wish that we could trust them with this standard. I mean, it certainly sounds bad to do anything that results in the harm to the health and safety of another person, but we know that we're in the dumbest timeline where tweeting out emojis will somehow be chalked up to doing that. So, no, I don't trust them. These are individuals who are at some level democratically elected. I think that codes of conduct should have things against bribery and clear conflicts of interest, which we know municipal councillors are particularly susceptible because they tend to get kind of lobbied by developers and things like that. And we don't want them to be taking bribes for designations. But no, I don't. I think we've seen enough, particularly in Ontario, that these are just going to be abused and, as you say, used to gang up against individuals who are expressing heterodox views. What do you think, Christine?
I think that this is so dangerous. It's going to create a groupthink and uniformity within council. It's going to result in those one, divergent councillor maybe not even expressing themselves at this point. And anyone who might agree with one of those divergent points of view, when they see what can be done to, the person who stands out, who's slightly different, they're going to say, I'm not going to throw my hat in with their lot. I don't want to have the same treatment. This is completely undemocratic. The whole concept of these integrity commissioners needs to be overhauled, and overhauled in the opposite direction, like not doing what the Ford government is proposing. They need to take this whole system and change it entirely. I mean, when I read, the news story of what had happened to this councillor in London, I was like, oh, it's another story of someone tweeting something. And I went and looked up her tweet, and I could not believe that it was emojis. Like, are you going to discipline a councillor member because they make facial expressions in response to something that staff says? If you have, a pleading face or a flushed face because of something that the staff member said, does your actual reaction constitute bullying and harassment? Because that's essentially what emojis are supposed to convey. It's supposed to convey your emotion about how you're feeling. So are emotional reactions now prohibited at city council? I also appreciated, Josh, you pointing out what these emojis are called, because I did not know that it was called pleading face or flushed face. They're all kind of just like random emojis to me. I didn't know they had particular names, so I appreciate that. Anyway, I think that this whole thing is just such a mess, and I cannot understand why anyone would sign up to do a job like this when this is what you go through. And that mentality is very harmful to democracy and harmful to local democracy in particular, which we are, as we know, we're the closest to. It has the most impact on our direct lives. So bad on you, Integrity Commissioner and London City Council. I'm going to turn now to my news headline, which is about TikTok. So the Trudeau government recently ordered TikTok to shut down its corporate Canadian offices, which are located in Toronto and in Vancouver. But the app can still be used. And this, I guess, is good news to me and Joanna, because I think we're the only two here that use this evil app. I recently got it to post clips from our YouTube channel and from Canadian Justice. So you can see clips of our content on my TikTok channel. Anyway, the shutdown order in Canada came after a months-long national security review of TikTok under the Canada Investment Act, the Investment Canada Act. And TikTok, as we all know, is owned by a Beijing-based company called ByteDance, and there have been, a few years of officials expressing concern in both Canada and the United States that under Chinese law, ByteDance can be forced to share data with the Chinese government. And there's also other concerns that have been raised about potential that the Chinese government could manipulate the algorithm, and this could result in foreign interference, and things that are happening in Canada. That's another sort of thing that has been raised in the public discourse. But the specific concerns about national security resulting from this Investment Canada Act, those have not been disclosed. So we don't actually know what specifically the government found that caused them to reach this conclusion to ban TikTok offices, but not the app in Canada. And look, even though I use TikTok, I am highly skeptical and suspicious of the Chinese Communist Party. I have some concerns about TikTok, even though I do have an account. And I just don't know at this point what to make of those concerns. It's been banned on devices of federal employees in Canada since February 2023. But I do think that if there are significant security concerns, they need to be addressed and we should be informed of them. I don't really like being in the dark about this. If there are concerns, the government could regulate the app. They could ban the app if the concerns are serious enough. They've banned Huawei from Canada being on our 5G and 4G networks. So instead of addressing those concerns, if those exist, Canada has ordered the closure of the corporate offices, which I don't even know what it achieves. The Canadian business is essentially being dissolved, and that means hundreds of people who have these jobs are now going to be put out of work. And it also makes addressing issues with TikTok harder. Now there will be no corporate representation of the company here. And Canada's Privacy Commissioner, a man named Philippe Dufresne, has told the House Ethics Committee that shutting TikTok offices in Canada down will make privacy probes harder. And he gave an example. The Federal Privacy Commission, along with the provincial counterparts in Alberta, Quebec, and British Columbia, are currently investigating TikTok to see if they unlawfully collected and shared young users' information. And right now, in order to do those investigations, privacy laws in Canada allow the commissioner to seek a court order to force the company to provide evidence and testimony to support that investigation. And that order can be enforced within Canada. But if there is no Canadian presence, it becomes an issue of private international law where the Canadian court order would need to be taken to the court of a foreign jurisdiction and ask for our court order to be enforced by foreign courts, which is a lot harder to do. So TikTok has responded to all of this shutdown order by filing a legal challenge. They filed an application in BC court seeking an order to set aside the shutdown and to pause it in the interim. TikTok claims that the minister's decision was unreasonable and driven by improper purposes, and that it failed to engage with TikTok on purported substance of the concerns that led to this order. So they're essentially sort of saying, if there are national security concerns, you didn't even engage with us on those concerns. The company has argued that the government ordered measures that bear no rational connection to the national security risks that it identifies. It says the reasons for the order are unintelligible, fail to reveal a rational chain of analysis, and is rife with logical fallacies. And they claim that the company participates in important Canadian public policy issues at the federal and provincial level, including those related to online safety, elections, and culture. They cite that they worked with Elections Canada and the Privy Council Office on partnerships to support election integrity on TikTok during the last election. And they claim that the Foreign Investment Review and Economic Security branch of the government abruptly finished the company's national security review at the end of October and ordered the company to wind up its Canadian operations a week later. It says that there were less onerous options that were available, and that this will cause the destruction of significant economic opportunities to Canadian creators, artists, and businesses, and the Canadian cultural community more broadly. So, as usual, we have this federal government taking a pretty serious issue and just completely botching it. We are left with this weird half measure that seems to do more harm than good. Users in Canada, content creators can still use the app. We don't know what the national security concerns are. We don't know if they're being addressed, and they don't seem to be being addressed. And instead, the headquarters of the company is just being booted out of the reach of Canadian regulation. Great. What does that achieve? I don't know. It's just, so typical of the approach taken by this government. But, at least I can still continue to post my TikToks. Joanna, as the other user of the app in this podcast, Josh is too much of a skeptic, I think, to use TikTok. But Joanna, what do you think?
Or he just cares about his mental health more, because that algorithm is scary sticky. It really is. It literally knows me better than I know myself, and realizes things about me before I realize them myself. But yeah, I mean, this is pretty classic Canadian passive aggressiveness. We're going to do something, so it looks like we're taking something seriously, but it's not actually a bold move, and it's not actually going to do anything, right? It's kind of the national security equivalent of sending $250 checks to make people feel better. But meanwhile, just ratcheting up the national deficit. So it makes absolutely no sense. I agree that there are national security concerns with TikTok, but if that's the case, you want them to have a footprint in Canada so that you can deal with them, you can summon them, you can request information from them. This just makes it much more difficult and complicated, assuming that Canada does not have a particularly competent overseas intelligence capacity, which I presume we don't. But then look, the elephant in the room in all of this, and I'm on TikTok enough to know that many creators are saying after January 20th, come and find me here. After January 20th, I'll have to go back from being a content creator to being a nurse or a teacher, is that Trump looks like he's very seriously considering banning TikTok, and he's threatened it a few times. But I don't see how TikTok is viable if there's no US, if it's not viable in the US, just because there's so many more Americans, and it would be really weird if we were only getting Canadian TikTok creators. So TikTok may be in its dwindling days, and as much as I've enjoyed it, even I see that that's good for me and my mental health and my screen time. Although TikTok, because it's so algorithmically accurate, it's more enjoyable than watching TV, right? Because it's just you can watch shorts for 30 minutes that one will be about recipes and one will be about fitness. But anyways, I'm not going to give you too much of an eye into my very non-basic soul. Okay, so rather than take a break, we thought we would give you a quick update on our Giving Tuesday campaign, which kicked off right after Thanksgiving a few weeks ago. And we are matching donations up to $100,000 pot, which has been generously provided by some donors. So now is an amazing time to double your impact. Whatever you can donate helps. We are 100% privately funded. We don't receive any money from the government, which should be obvious, but people still ask us that. And we have an ambitious year ahead, and we want to do more cases, and we want to take on more integrity commissioners, for example, and we want to do more to defend your rights. So if you can, we really appreciate it if you donate. You can go to theccf.ca/donate for all of the details. I think right now, we're sitting at about 75% of the goal. So we've raised about $70,000, and we'll be matching your donations, 100% of your donations up until the end of the year. So thank you in advance. Okay. Now, I am going to talk about the regulation of the internet and the conservative counterproposal to the Online Harms Act. So, of course, the Online Harms Act has been the sort of centerpiece of the Liberals' justice strategy this year. It was announced in late February by Justice Minister Arif Virani, and this was presented originally as a four-part comprehensive overhaul of regulating the internet, as well as updating certain criminal laws, ostensibly to protect victims of online revenge porn, children, and minorities. However, as listeners of this podcast will be aware, because we've talked about it probably more than any other single topic since it was announced, this has been the subject of a lot of backlash and concern, not just by the CCF, but really by civil liberties groups from across the political spectrum. And this is because it takes such a draconian approach to regulating and criminalizing speech. So just to recap, Part 1 of the bill proposed to create a new regulator which would police harmful content on social media. Part 2 proposed to beef up existing criminal laws governing hate speech, and also created a new standalone criminal offense for any crime motivated by hatred, punishable by up to life in prison. Part 3 gave the Canadian Human Rights Commission the power to fine people for online hate speech. And Part 4 created mandatory reporting requirements for child pornography on platforms. And so Virani announced recently that the Liberals proposed to split off Part 1, which is the part with the online regulator, and Part 4, which is the mandatory reporting requirements, to split those parts off from Parts 2 and 3 and to prioritize Parts 1 and 4. And this was presumably to streamline the passage of that new cutoff bill through the House, and perhaps acknowledging that Parts 2 and 3 needed serious work, or better from our view, were dead. So I was in Ottawa last week at the committee called Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights, which is a House of Commons committee, and it comprises a few MPs from all of the parties in Parliament, and they were undergoing a pre-study on the Online Harms Act. So I appeared as a witness representing the CCF, and you can see my comments on our YouTube channel. But essentially, I said that even with the proposed split, which from our view was on the whole a good decision, mostly because it made it less likely for the worst parts of the bill to pass. But even that being, Part 1 in particular still posed severe threats to free expression. It would create this digital safety commissioner with vast unchecked powers to police harmful content, which is one of these vague terms that we don't really know what it means. Platforms don't really know what it means. So it means that they're going to flag and remove a lot of expression that will turn out to be protected expression. And there are severe fines. We also know that this new regulator was estimated by the Parliamentary Budget Office to cost $200 million over the next 5 years. So I said Part 1 cannot proceed either. So in committee, and I noticed this in some of the other meetings of the committee leading up to my appearance, that the Conservatives were talking a lot about a new private members bill that hadn't really been on my radar, called Bill 412. And both in my committee appearance and other committee appearances, where other witnesses were discussing and critiquing online harms, the Conservative members of the committee were really pushing this new private members bill, which is proposed by Michelle Rempel Garner, a Conservative MP from Alberta, who in general I find very thoughtful, very intelligent. She has a great Substack. But I think that her bill is not a great alternative to the online harms. It's not much better. And in some ways, I would argue it's actually worse than online harms. So first, 412 is much wider in scope than the Online Harms Act. It applies to an online service or application. So basically the whole internet, all apps, everything online. In contrast to Part 1 of Online Harms, which applies only to social media platforms and some porn websites. And 412 would impose a new duty on platforms to essentially create a sanitized internet for anyone under the age of 18. So teenagers and children. And we'll get into how we should think about this group of minors and their rights, because children, yes, do have constitutional rights. So under 412, platforms would be obliged to mitigate risks that minors would be exposed not only to content that is pretty clearly harmful, like cannabis advertising or sexual abuse imagery, but also would apply to this whole category of much vaguer, again, harder to define content, like content that would promote anxiety or loneliness, or that is harmful to a minor's dignity. So this is very variable and obviously will vary depending on the individual and their psychological state. And again, we know that when we have these vague terms and when they are backed by severe fines, platforms will just err on the side of anything that is at all in the gray zone, has any gray shades, will be taken down. The fines range up to $25 million. So that's higher than the $10 million that's proposed under online harms. And then individuals or their parents could sue for even more damages. So this just creates a huge ambit of regulatory risks, which probably the rational response from platforms would be just to ban minors from accessing their services altogether. But it gets worse. 412 also would forbid a minor from holding an account without first verifying the contact information for any of the user's parents. So you would need to get permission from your parents before signing up for a social media account or for a platform, even probably for any type of app. So think this through. So this means that minors would need to go to their parents, ask them, will you sign up for this app for me before they can access, could be a research app, could be an app for people who are engaging in some type of self-harm. And this really, thinking this through creates a huge moral hazard. So think about a teenager who's in an abusive household looking for resources on how to get help, but who doesn't feel comfortable with asking a teacher in school, and they have to ask a parent to verify their information before using any app or social media platform. Think about a teenager or a child even in a strict religious household where the internet is forbidden, and they want to use, let's say, the school library computer to seek different perspectives, but they need permission from their parent first. So I think this is just, if we think this through, Canadians would not accept this severe of a curtailment on kids, teenagers, minors' rights. And keep in mind that the law in Canada does recognize that minors can make very serious moral decisions for themselves. The Supreme Court has recognized that 16-year-old, in this case, Jehovah's Witnesses, who had religious objections to receiving blood transfusions, which would be life-saving care, that if they are judged to be in full capacity and making an autonomous decision, they can refuse life-saving care. So it's hard to hold that, and also hard that, and at the same time, that the government could prevent them from accessing the internet. And look, it's clear that yes, the internet hosts many shady, dangerous characters, but the internet also is where knowledge lives, where also mentors and communities live. So there's a lot of good that would be blocked off with the bad. And I'm just not sure that this is the right approach with these big terms that capture so much in there. There's a famous law school essay that I read, and probably Josh and Christine, you read too, that talks about the penumbra of the law. So not just what the law itself says, but the sort of like scope of reasonable inquiry. So something like promotes anxiety, that's going to capture all kinds of things that we don't want to be, that are undoubtedly protected expression. So Greg Lukianoff, who is the founder of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression in the US, had a brilliant essay recently on his Substack talking about the Kids Online Safety Act, which is a new US bill that apparently Trump is pushing and Elon is supporting as well, but it also suffers from very similar problems. And he wrote, when you're trying to solve a problem that relates to expression, you should exhaust every possible solution before focusing on top-down legislative solutions that will almost always have unintended consequences. So I can't agree with this more. MP Rempel Garner seems to recognize, based on my interaction with her at committee, that this bill is not ready to move forward, that it needs serious consultation and amendment, and she seems open to hearing feedback. But I don't know, it's pretty fundamentally flawed in my view. Josh, you were actually the one who first brought these serious issues with 412 to my attention and did a quick review of the bill, and thank you for that. So now, having had a little bit more time to think about it and having watched my committee appearance, do you think 412 is a better way to go than the Online Harms Act? One thing that MP Rempel Garner kept saying was that it was preferable to proceed by way of law rather than regulation. And she sees 412 as a law which would have defined categories of harmful content that would be debated in advance, as opposed to a regulator sort of making decisions shrouded in mystery. Do you think that distinction holds up?
Yeah, I do. So there's, I think both bills are bad. They both have serious problems for freedom of expression. And frankly, I think Rempel Garner's is probably plainly unconstitutional, at least for older, 16, 17-year-olds. But it is better to actually write that in the law. Like this current government has left all kinds of things to regulation, and that's bad because they don't get debated in committees, and you don't get to figure out whether they're a good idea or a bad idea. So good on MP Rempel Garner for trying to spell out what this bill would actually do rather than leaving it to a regulator. And there's some things about her bill that are also an improvement on C63. Like she is focused on children, which is what the Liberals told us that they're focused on, but their bill actually regulates the internet for everyone, including adults who should be able to, argue back and forth vociferously on social media. So at least she's targeting the real problem that there's consensus about, which is that some kids are accessing some content that they shouldn't be accessing. And there's another part of her bill which has been pretty much ignored, that is maybe not a bad idea, and that's requiring at least that social media platforms allow for parental controls. So parents who are concerned about this could, go into the iPad and make sure their kid's account is, not exposing them to certain things. And I think that already exists to some degree, but there may be something to that idea. I don't know if this is the right proposal per se, but I think there's something to that. But yeah, I was reading this bill and it was just pretty shocking. Like I was thinking about myself when I was a 17-year-old in a university dorm. I could drive. I lived in a different city from my parents, but I wouldn't be able to use social media to, but back then it was Facebook, to discuss things on Facebook with my friends or to do research on topics that are, adult topics, because there's some vague language about, not having mitigating content that could lead to loneliness or whatever in this bill. So yeah, it's not a great bill. I doubt it'll go forward, but it's good that we're at least debating this now rather than next year when it has a lot bigger chance of moving ahead. Christine, you're a parent. What do you think about all this?
So I don't want my children on any social media at all, obviously. None of them are allowed to have social media. My stepdaughter's 11, she's not allowed to have a phone. I'm very against devices for kids. And that's a parenting decision that everyone makes different decisions, but those are the decisions that we made in our house. I share the criticisms that you guys have raised about Rempel's bill. I also want to make sure we keep things in perspective. This is a private member's bill. It's not going to pass. It was written without the resources of the giant government bureaucracy. The government bill, the Liberals bill, the Online Harms Act, was much more likely to pass. Now, because of the pushback, it looks like it's being split and might be dead on arrival entirely. So, I mean, that really needs to be the focus of the criticism, because that one had the potential to pass and the bureaucracy supported the creation of it. So, you know, there are all kinds of resources put into that legislation that Rempel wouldn't have had. Now, I think we should, you know, monitor it and be aware of what's being proposed, because obviously, you know, we don't live in a fantasy land. We think that the Conservatives are likely to form the next government. So whatever they're proposing now will, I think, bear some sort of resemblance to what they may ultimately propose when they form government, if that happens, or, you know, when that happens. So what is proposed as a private member's bill, though, may bear almost no resemblance to what is proposed when they form government, though. So I think the focus of our criticism is better directed at killing this government legislation, which has, you know, pretty broad sweeping implications. And one of the things Rempel has proposed, so she's proposed a number of things. She proposed her private members bill, but she also proposed just passing Part 4 of the Online Harms Act by itself on unanimous consent. And I think that could happen. And if that happens, I really think that that's good. You know, we've called for Part 4 to pass, the stuff that would protect children from child sexual abuse online and make it easier to prosecute those terrible crimes. And if that passes by itself, I think Part 1 is dead too. Like, that would mean that that's the only part that is passed. It would be good politics, because then everyone gets to claim a win, and it would actually be good for Canada and good for children. So that's sort of what I have to say on the issue. I'll turn now to our bad legal takes. I'll start with mine, and mine goes to the London Catholic School Board. And it has been reported previously that the school board was banning books that contain the N-word. I will not say that word, as Talib Noor Mohammed, the MP, tried to, you know, bait me into saying in a parliamentary committee a few weeks ago. You can watch that exchange on YouTube. I don't think that people should say the N-word, but language is context specific. And there are a number of very important books that contain that word and that are not, you know, necessarily racist books. They're books.
All right, so looks like we lost Christine right before she was about to do her BLT to a power outage. So I have what she's got written down here, so I'm gonna do it for her. Okay, so Christine's BLT goes to the London Catholic School Board. It was previously reported that the school board was banning books that contain the N-word, a word that she will not say, even though an MP tried to bait her into saying it in Parliament a few weeks ago. So the school board says they're taking an informed approach that certain books containing triggering language and content should not be required or mandatory reading for assessment in our school. And that's resulted in a number of books being removed from the curriculum, including a lot of books by Black authors. And one of these is a famous book by Lawrence Hill called The Book of, I'm not going to use the word, which was previously being taught in some grade 12 classes. Joanna, should I use the word? I'm not going to use it.
No.
That's the name of a book. So that book can no longer be mandatory or even taught in the London School Board because it contains the N-word. And the author of this book has said that, you know, a board ban on teaching books by him or other Black writers containing that word is essentially going to erase their work from the classroom. And so a local teacher in this London Catholic School Board named Heather Hamilton, who's previously taught that book to her grade 12 class, has now been placed on paid leave after she did an interview with the London Free Press expressing outrage over this ban. And students from her school are pushing back, and it's really encouraging to see that they're pushing back to oppose this book ban. And Christine says she agrees with them, language is context specific, and banning books that address the history of racism, because they use that language, undermines our ability to learn from the past. And I couldn't agree more with that bad legal take. So that's Christine's. Okay, so for mine, mine goes to this criminal defense lawyer who I actually really like. We've been following each other on Twitter for years. Her name's Stephanie Hyens, and she just happens to be totally wrong about something here. I think it's where the conservative and the libertarian in me split apart. So last night, my friend who lives in the Oshawa area sent me a shocking news story. Basically, one of the criminals who was involved in an armed robbery of a liquor store near Toronto in April, who fled in a van going the wrong way down the Highway 401 and crashed into a car, killing 4 members of a family, has been sentenced and released. And so this happened in April, and this person was sentenced to 5.5 months for his part in all of this. And this guy had been accused of robbery, breaching his probation order, etc., at 13 different charges in all. And he pleaded guilty, so he was given 5.5 months. And with credit, he is already out despite this crash that killed 4 people. And so Haynes, this criminal defense lawyer, tweeted when I tweeted out about this and expressing my frustration that he was just a passenger. And this implied that the 5.5 month sentence for this robbery he was involved in that led to this, the death of 4 people, was enough. And I pushed back on that. And she said, well, you're just trying to satisfy your emotional need for revenge. And, I understand that sentiment. I remember the Humboldt bus crash, the guy driving the truck that led to that incident. There was a lot of discussion about whether deporting him was just seeking revenge because, obviously he didn't intend to kill all those poor innocent hockey players. So I get that argument. And to tell you the truth, I am to some degree interested in revenge when people, cause such heinous crimes. But I'm also interested in deterrence. I think that, criminals who receive such short sentences for serious crimes know that they can get away with it, and other people see that, and there needs to be longer sentences and real consequences to reduce the risk of this stuff happening again. And even if you don't believe in retribution, or even if you think deterrence doesn't work very well, you should still believe in separation. So that's the idea that we put people in jail sometimes because they've harmed other people, and we don't want them to harm us again for a certain period of time. And I feel like this is someone who needs to be separated from society. It's a repeat offender involved in a robbery that involved a knife, and we don't know if he was holding the knife or not. It's not really clear. Presumably he wasn't. But he was like the getaway. He was in the getaway van, and that something bad is going to happen if you're speeding away from a robbery like that. So anyway, I'm a big believer in separation and deterrence, and a little bit of retribution sometime. And I think the sentence was just too short. So that's my BLT for this week. Joanna, what's yours?
So my BLT goes to Michelle Thibodeau, who is a retired federal IT consultant who recently and unsuccessfully claimed $19,500 in damages after seeing a sign that said "Caution, wet floor" in a government building. And Mr. Thibodeau claimed that English-only warnings cause him loss of enjoyment of life. He said, "I feel that my rights are infringed when I am confronted with this type of unilingual or predominantly English signage," because of course there were other signs that said "attention," which is the same in French, "attention." So he had to say predominantly English. And then he went on to say, "It causes me frustration, loss of enjoyment of life. I suffered stress because my identity as a Francophone was threatened, and I felt like a second-class citizen. Now, it turns out that Mr. Thibodeau is a bit of a renegade language, a private language detective, and he trawls the internet to see instances where Canadian public bodies or publicly funded bodies are not respecting perfect bilingualism. So, for example, in 2014, he claimed over $18,000 in damages after an Anglophone Air Canada flight attendant, a federally regulated employee, mistakenly served him a Sprite instead of a 7-Up. No, I'm not joking. And this grift has occasionally worked. Mr. Thibodeau successfully got $11,000 after he discovered that the website at the St. John's Airport Authority wished travelers a happy St. Patrick's Day in English only. He was not at the airport, he was just on the website, and that presumably also caused him loss of enjoyment of life. Well, all I can say to you, Monsieur Thibodeau, and by the way, his claim against the wet floor sign was rejected by the federal court. But if a wet floor sign threatens your identity, I'm afraid that you have much bigger problems than any court can solve. But keep going with your grift.
I think I suffered a loss of enjoyment of life just reading that story from Blacklocks. All right, so that's the end of the show. As usual, we ask you to rate us, review us, and subscribe. We have a really good rating, I just noticed the other day, so thanks to everybody who's already done that. You can support our work by subscribing to our YouTube channel, by following us on X, or by visiting our website, ccf.ca, and signing up for our weekly Freedom Update newsletter. The CCF is a nonpartisan legal charity funded by your donations, so please do donate on our website if you can. Thanks for listening.
Oh, and wait, and we should tell them about our holiday break.
Oh yeah, so I guess no show till when, Joanna? Early January.
Yeah, until the first week of January. Next week is Christmas, but then, yeah, I mean, it goes by pretty fast. The week after that, we'll be back. Unless, what day is New Year's Day?
It's the 1st, so it looks like it'll be the 2nd week of January.
Oh yeah, unless we record on the 2nd. So we'll either see you on the 1st or 2nd week of January.
All right, well, I guess we'll have to figure that out. All right, happy holidays, everyone.